Welcome everybody to our 59th webinar in our fourth season. Today we have as guest Steven Renders. I'm very happy that you had the possibility to step in, Steven, with a presentation on data flows and why they are interesting for Power BI and Business Central. Before we continue, and I give the floor to Steven, a couple of housekeeping rules. Like always, be invited to post questions. So give your part on it. And of course, as always, your microphone is muted. So use the GoToWebinar question window. And I'll, as your moderator, Luc van Vugt, will pick up the questions. I'll do my best today to get the recording again on our channel. Today, I'm not that fit, so probably it will be tomorrow. It will be there, and feel free to use it, to share it, to whatever, give knowledge to others about this topic, of course. If you're not following us yet on the newsletter, this is the link to subscribe to it. And like always, we will communicate upcoming webinars. The following 5 are in the planning already and working on a couple of others already also. So if you want to stay in the know, subscribe to the newsletter, or once in a while throw your eye on the website, or follow us on Twitter also. Before I'm going to hand over to Steven, like always, a call to everybody. If you have topics, feel free to come up with them. If you want to be a speaker, you're also invited. And yes, there has been many people already taking part in the webinars. You won't be the first, you won't be the last. There is no competition. You won't be the best or the worst. Everybody is welcome to be a speaker. Of course, like always, I want to thank Fornaf, being our sponsor, enabling to use the platform. And Steven, I think I'm going to hand over to you. I don't introduce you, as I said to you up front, as many people know you, and I leave it a little bit to you too, but I'm very happy to have Steven here, being one of the guys on reporting and Power BI in our Business Central world, to open up that part. So I'm very curious what you're going to share with us today. So let me make you presenter and allowing you to share your screen.
All right, thank you very much. Let me check.
Yeah.
All right.
Loud and clear, I could say.
Super. Thank you very much, Luc. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about why data flows are so interesting for Power BI and Business Central. My name is Steven. Voilà. From Belgium, non-native English speaking, but I'll do my best. And in case you might have some questions after the webinar, feel free to always send me an email, and when I have the time, I'm surely going to try to answer as soon as possible. And you can also find me at Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. All right, and let's get down to the content. I want to talk actually about why data flows are interesting for Power BI and also for Business Central. Which I'm going to start to explain, of course, what are data flows. I'm going to do it in a couple of different topics. First, query design, because data flows like Power BI and Power Platform can fetch data from Business Central by making use of the existing APIs or custom APIs. And in many cases, actually, personally, I think almost always for Power BI, it might be better to use custom-made APIs. Depends a little bit on the volume of data. So I'm going to start a little bit to explain, okay, this is how you can create those queries or APIs. And then we're going to dive into data flows, how we can create a data set in there. After we have done that, there is the standard way of doing it and the multi-company way. We'll see how we can consume that data flow data in Power BI. That's one of the main reasons to use it. It's also named Power BI data flows. But of course, you can also consume the information in, for example, Excel, and because Excel also has a Power Query engine. And because we can consume it in Excel, that can also make it interesting in combination with the new Excel layouts. So we'll also dive and see how we can make that possible. At the end, I'm going to cover some, let's say, tips and tricks and reasons why data flows should be interesting, and what are the advantages, what are maybe also the disadvantages, and so on. And I will have some time for some Q&A, and as Luc has also already explained, if you might have some questions, type them in, and we'll try to answer them also as soon as possible. All right, so the first part, why are data flows interesting for Power BI and Business Central? Preparing the queries. Now, what I mean with that is that if you would like to get data out of Business Central, and I'm mainly talking about Business Central SaaS, of course, although for Business Central on-prem, it might also work. Then in the past, we were kind of limited to the OData web services, which are based on query objects and page objects. They still exist, but it's actually better, I think, to use the APIs. And Business Central has a set of default APIs it exposes. You can also create custom APIs. And I think most, if not all, of the default APIs from Microsoft are based on page objects, with good reason. And of course, APIs can also be based on query objects. And my personal preference for anything Power BI reporting related would be the query APIs or the query objects. Now, if you would like to have a look which APIs are available, I have the link in the slides. And well, normally it opens the web browser, where you can find some documentation about all of the APIs Microsoft has created. And the fields, I should say, the metadata, that are retrieved. So, small example here, I have the customer API, and you can see which fields that this API returns. Actually, should go here in the properties. You see all of the fields. And of course, also some linked tables. All right. So if you are unfamiliar with this, then what is very interesting to know is that there are quite a lot of out-of-the-box APIs available. Most of the master data is in here, GL accounts, customers, items, vendors, and so on. Then we also have transactional data like sales orders, purchase orders, and there are also, let's say, the posted transactional data, the sales invoice lines, and then of course some ledger entries, and some other information is also available here. So if you're looking for something, most of it will probably be already in these APIs. Unless, for example, you might be interested in anything production or manufacturing related, then I think besides the items, you're not going to find much here. The default API set that we have there. And the advantage of these APIs, the default out-of-the-box APIs, is that we have quite a lot of them compared to the standard web services that you have in Business Central. So if you go and have a look inside Business Central itself, you can go to the web services page, and here you can find all of the OData web services that are available. Also quite a few here, but let's say in the reporting Power BI context, I don't really use them, because if you import, for example, the Power BI customer list in Power BI, you notice that it's not a list of customers, but customer ledger entries. So Power BI-wise, maybe not so interesting to use, and in that case, I usually create custom web services. But the out-of-the-box APIs are very good. Now, in many cases, it can be interesting to create new APIs for Power BI, for Dataflows, for Power Platform. You should be aware of the context in which you will be running these APIs. When I'm talking about Dataflows for Power BI and in general the Power BI context, then we are only reading information. We don't need to write back anything to Business Central. So in that view, I'm going to try to also optimize the APIs for reading consumption. APIs are usually better than web services. According to Microsoft, they are about 30% faster out of the box. I haven't really tested it myself yet, but I can believe it. And if you would like new APIs or if you would like to extend existing APIs, that requires a little bit of a development, because there are quite a few out-of-the-box APIs there. But imagine that on the customer, you have added a shoe size field because you want to keep track of the shoe sizes of customers, and you also want to use that field in Power BI to do some shoe size analysis. Well, then the standard API will not have that field. So in that case, you also cannot extend that API at this moment. So that requires some development of a new API. Now, it's not rocket science, but it is still a development. And I have a few small examples of some APIs that I have created. And there is the from scratch way of doing it. If you have the asset Dataflows and Visual Studio Code, there are some nice wizards to do it. But basically, you're going to add one or multiple data items to a query object. I'm using query objects here. And you're then going to publish them, for example, as an API query. You can also create API pages. The difference between a normal query, an API query, a normal page, and an API page is mainly here on top in the properties. Then, okay, I have some a data item. I have a query for items. I have a query for, let's say, some other data too, customer ledgers, and so on. The interesting part about query objects is that you can fetch data from a table, but if you apply a sum method, you actually also get a group by all of the other columns with a subtotal of, in this case, the amount. And that is going to reduce the size of the data set. And with the pages, I think that's not yet possible. That's why for BI purposes, I usually prefer to work with the query objects. And what's the effect? Basically, you have your database. So let me try to draw that in the database. We have a big table with ledger entries. I think a normal API is going to fetch all of that data unless you apply some filters in the URL. But if you work with the query object and the group by, you will get the same number of columns with a smaller data set. So that's one of the reasons why that's interesting. Now, if you're going to create APIs, then a very important property I did not put in here is the data access intent read-only. You should actually put that in all of the APIs that you're going to use for Power BI, because it doesn't only make the API read-only, but it sends the data or the query to a replica of the production database in VC SAS. So we get better performance, and also while you are refreshing data, while the queries are running, and the production database is not influenced. So that's a big recommendation. So what have I done? What I typically do is I create a few APIs, some master data items, salespeople, some transactions. And you might wonder, why do you have the items in here but not the customers? Well, because for customers, I'm going to use the standard API, and for items, I needed a few fields that were not available in the standard API. So you create a few queries. And when I think about Power BI, remember that we are always building according to a star or a Snowflake schema, and that means one table in the middle with the facts you would like to analyze. And typically, the facts are the measurable numbers like amounts and quantities, and you surround that with slicers and dicer tables or lookup tables, or what we call in BI dimensional tables. That could be a customer, that could be an item, and that could be a calendar or a date table, and so on. And you connect it to the fact table, and if you zoom out, it resembles a star, hence the star schema. You can, of course, also have some tables that are linked to the tables and the points of the star, like, for example, salespeople are linked to customer. If you zoom out, it starts to resemble a snowflake, hence the snowflake schema. Why is that important? Well, typically, for all of these tables I have in my star or snowflake schema, I'm going to use different APIs. So I'm not going to create one API for everything, but an API per table in my schema, because I then consider these APIs like little blocks of Lego that I can very easily reuse when I would like to create other reports. Voila. So it's not the intention for me to teach you how to develop APIs. There's, for example, a very good course also from Arend Jan about that, but you should be aware that there are built-in APIs. You can create custom APIs based on queries, based on pages. All of them have advantages and disadvantages. So the demo was here in Visual Studio Code. You create a few APIs, you publish the app. And as soon as you do that, then of course in Power BI, you're able to import that data. We very quickly also demo that. I'm going to launch Power BI Desktop. And once Power BI Desktop is launched, we can typically do a get data at the left top. As soon as it responds, the button, and I'm going to click on More Connectors. Wait until the pop-up opens, and there we have Business Central. If you select Business Central in there, it will connect to your Business Central instance. The first time you have to authenticate, and next time that will be cached. So I already have done that. You can see your environments. I have a Power BI sandbox here. When I open that, the companies, and of course inside the companies we see APIs. The standard APIs from Microsoft are in here, and if you test them out, then you're going to notice customers are really customers and not customer ledger entries. And these are typically based on page APIs, which also have some possibilities to show other records to expand. Your custom APIs are available under the advanced APIs. So I created a fictive company called Solutize. In which I have my items and purchases, salespeople, and so on. By the way, also very interesting to know, recently with the latest release of Business Central, Microsoft also released a new set of financial APIs, which are going to find accounts, general ledger entries, but also, what I think is really interesting, dimension set entries. Because until now, there wasn't really an out-of-the-box API that held the dimension set entries. All right, and then you select the APIs you would like to use. You can transform them, import them into Power BI, and you can start to create your reports. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use a Dataflow. Why am I going to use a Dataflow? So let me first say why, and then how. But if I go back to Power BI, I minimized it, I didn't close it. What happens is that once you import some data in Power BI, you're going to see your tables appearing in here. You can model the tables into a star or a Snowflake. A few tables, a lot of tables, it all depends. And typically the difference between a sales report and a purchase report, or report A and report B, is usually the facts. Sales facts, purchase facts, financial information, warehouse information, and so on. But customers, items, vendors, the master data, supplemental data, and the points of the star or the Snowflake are usually always the same. Now, the data source is Business Central. So I'm going to import data from Business Central into these tables every time that you do a refresh. Now, if I have 1 report, 2 Power BI reports, 5 Power BI reports, 10 Power BI reports, and schedule those in refreshes, then I'm typically going to import the same data but in different reports. For example, items will be imported in this report, but also on the other reports that consume items. Customers too, and so on. So you're actually importing the same information over and over and over again from Business Central. Wouldn't it be easier if we could just import that data from Business Central into a table once and then consume that data in Power BI? Well, I think the answer to that question is yes, and hence Dataflows. Dataflows are going to allow you to do that. It's like kind of a mini data warehouse in the middle that you're going to create without really having to know a lot about data warehouses. The real data warehouse, or let's say SQL Server analysis services, you might get further, but that then also becomes a little bit too technical. So let's dive into Dataflows. What we are going to do is we are going to create the data set in a Dataflow. Now, a Dataflow, as you will see shortly, is no more or less than Power Query online, the online version of Power Query. And the interesting part of a data flow is that all of the extract, transform, and load that you typically do in Power Query in each and every Power BI report, you now only need to do once. You can reuse all of that functionality. Hence here, Dataflows to the rescue. Now, behind the scenes, there's going to be an Azure data lake that will be set up for you, in which the data is going to be stored. If you know how, then you can also go directly to that data lake, but we're not really going to see that. That's going to happen behind the scenes. To be able to create a data flow, we need a few things. You need a Power BI account. And basically, you can get it for free if you go to powerbi.microsoft.com. There you can create a new account. But in Power BI, you also need to be able to create a workspace. That's where you start to pay, because you can only create a workspace if you have a Power BI Pro account, so not with the free account. So for Dataflows, you also need a Power BI Pro. Not extremely expensive. It's already included in the Office 365 A5 suite. And if not, you can buy it. I think it's about $8 per user per month. We need to create a workspace, because only when we create a workspace, we're able to create a data flow. You can create data flows from scratch. You can reuse older data flows. You can refresh data flows. You can share data flows. Okay, that's a lot of talk about data flows. Let's have a look at how it really works. So I'm simply going to log into powerbi.microsoft.com, and I'm going to create a workspace. You can simply create a workspace. I've already done that, actually. And if you go inside the workspace, then at the left top in the New button, and there is this data flow option, which you do not have available if you are in, let's say, a non-custom workspace like the My workspace. So only when you create a custom workspace, you have that data flow button available. That's why we need a workspace. I'm going to click on the Create a New Data Flow button, and here we have a few options. I will usually go for the one on the left if you start from scratch. If you already have some other data flows, you can link tables from other data flows if you would like to. You can also import a data flow, let's say, from another environment. So I have created one on my sandbox or test Power BI environment, and I would like to import on the production environment of a customer. That's also a possibility. And you can also import some data which is in Dataverse, but here apparently is still called Common Data Model or CDM. I'm going to click on Add New Tables, and this is now where the magic is going to happen. First, we need to select a data source, and that can be quite a lot of different data sources. And what we are going to use, for example, is Business Central. Now, a data flow can import data from one or multiple data sources, so you can combine the information coming from BC, but also some other data. When you select BC, you are prompted to enter information about environment, company, and so on. Don't do it, simply click on Next. You can enter the environment and company if you know them, but you don't have to. And the only thing you have to enter are your credentials the first time you have to connect to Business Central. If you click on Next, then the window updates and it will show you the different environments that you have, like I have also seen in Power BI Desktop a few moments ago. I will go to my sandbox, for example. If I open that, it's going to show me the companies, and inside of the companies, I will then see the data sources I have available, web services, APIs. I can select one of the standard APIs, custom APIs, web services. It doesn't matter, but as you can see, my custom APIs are now also available in here. Voilà, general ledger entry, present. Here you can then, for example, select one or multiple queries, but what you're noticing, if you have some Power BI experience, is that you are inside Power Query. So the same experience as you might already have in Power BI Desktop, because on Power BI Desktop, we also first use Power Query to import data. You select the API or APIs you are interested in, and then you click on Transform. And the next window is going to open. It will take a few seconds. But at the bottom of the screen, you can see that he is working on it and how much data is being imported. Voila, I have my general ledger entries. I have my item ledger entries in here. I can see my columns. You have the same possibilities like you already might have in Power Query. I can remove a column. I can apply filters if I would like to. We can change the data type of these fields. We can add columns using Power Query. We can do data transformations. I could talk a whole week about what we can do with Power Query. But trust me if I say you have about the same possibilities here in the Power Query of Dataflow than you have in the Power Query of Power BI Desktop. Maybe a few things might not be available. On the other hand, we have some things here which we do not have in Power BI Desktop. One of these things is different views of the data we are importing. And we have a diagram view, for example, and other views that we can select. I can go back to the schema view normally, or the data view, like that. Okay. Disable that again. All right. And we should also be able to see the steps on the right side, or did I turn that off? Schema view, step view. Normally I was looking for my steps here at the right side. All right. What does it matter? So I have my my data here. Okay. What we can now do is you can do some transformations, and at a certain moment you can do a save and close. However, and there are also a few other things that you can do. As you might have noticed, then by default, you first need to select a company. Either you select it in here or in the next step, and you choose your company, first environment, then company. Like we can do in Power Query and Power BI Desktop, here in Dataflows, you can also make it a multi-company query. To do that, we first need to select one of the APIs before we can then continue. And in the next screen, which is now opening, you should be able to see the steps at the right side, but I am not seeing them. Well, here I have my query settings. Well, here they are. So I have to enable my query settings again. You can see that the source is Business Central. And then we selected an environment, and then we selected a company. You see some navigational steps. Well, the navigational steps you can one by one undo until we are at the first navigational step, where we can see our environments. We can then expand data. We can see the company. We can expand the company. We can see the web services, and so on and so on. And you can turn this into a multi-company query. I have already done that and prepared a few, so let me open them instead of doing this here step by step. So I have one data flow here with the name master data, which contains customers, items, accounts, and sales people. If I click on edit, I'm going to open the Power Query editor. And what you're going to notice once the data refreshes is that we get the customers, items, and accounts, and so on, for all of the companies and also all of the environments. So I'm just waiting for this screen to update. It sometimes takes a few seconds. There's a little joke also on social media. Time you spend doing in Dataflows mostly is sometimes waiting until the screen refreshes, depending on the amount of data. All right. Remember, this is a multi-company. I have about 2 companies here, but also multiple environments, so that's why it might take a little longer here to refresh. It's also a free trial of Business Central, and it also doesn't always have the best performance. All right, I can see my environments. I can see the companies for each environment. I can see I went for the standard APIs, customers, and I see the data coming in. And because I'm now fetching customers from multiple companies and multiple environments, I also created 2 custom columns, customer key and salesperson key, which will allow me to link this customer table later to, for example, sales or salespeople, which is the combination of the environment, a dash sign, the company, a dash sign, and then the customer number to make it a unique key again. And these are transformations you can do in Power Query. I usually start with a first API that I have created, which I call underscore APIs, which is basically going to list me all of the APIs that Business Central produces in a multi-environment, multi-company way. So voila. I have all of the environments, I have the companies, I have the API types. This query I am not going to load, as you notice, but I'm always going to reference to create a new one. So the customers, the items, the accounts, and the salespeople are simply referencing this underscore API query, which I then, for example, filter on the API type I would like to use, and the API and the fields and so on. All right. Interesting is that we have in Dataflows is that depending on which step that we are, there is sometimes some information available about data folding. And as you might know or might not know, data folding is the capability of Power Query to send certain queries to the data source. Imagine if I would like to do a group by city in the customers, then Power Query can do it. Or it can send that query to Business Central, and Business Central can send back the result set. If Business Central is able to do that, then query folding is happening, and then Power Query needs to perform less, and Business Central will do a little bit more. But if you see this icon, then basically it shows you that there is no data folding happening. Business Central is not able to do this, so Power Query will take over. That is a consequence of doing this multi-company. If you create queries which are single company, query folding is usually going to happen also here in Power Query. All right. Don't want to talk too much here, but as you can see, I have created 2 data flows, one with master data, one with transactions. Now, why 2 data flows, says Steven? Why not everything in one data flow? Well, because once you have created your data flows, you can give them separate refresh schedules. So I see my data flows here, and I can schedule the refresh of these data flows. Remember, we are in a Power BI Pro license right now. That means that according to Microsoft documentation, we can refresh once an hour, but there are only 8 hours in a day. So we can refresh 8 times per day with the Power BI Pro. If you have a premium account, that will be 48 times per day. So that's why I typically create different data flows, because I can give them different refresh schedules. It's one of the only reasons to put information into different data flows. All right, so we have created a few data flows. We've seen how we can refresh the data flows. What we can also do is share a data flow with someone else in our organization, and that's also an advantage, but I didn't show how to do it. And in the beginning, when I was investigating data flows, I looked for a long time to find the share button on a data flow. Because if I go here on a report, it is very easy to share. There is usually a share button here. If I go to a data set, if I go to a dashboard, there's a share button. But if I go to a data flow, no share button. And I looked for it for a long time, and I still haven't found it. Apparently, what you need to do is share the workspace in which resides the data flow. And here we can define a workspace access, and then we can invite other people to be a part of this workspace with different rights, viewer, and so on. A viewer can only consume the data flows and data sets, and admin can do everything, and you have member and contributor in between. So if I would like to give these access to these data flows to someone else, I have to make them also a member of this workspace. Voila. So now you create the data flows. Basically, it's Power Query Online. You schedule the refresh of these data flows. That's important. You share the data flows. Right now, it's via sharing of the workspace. Hopefully, in the future, you might be able to share individual data flows too. I think there is an ID on that on the Power BI ID website of Microsoft. If you want to learn more about creating data flows, there's a lot to learn. I have some links here to Microsoft Learn, some free learning content, how to create data flows step by step. Basically, if you know Power Query, you know data flows, because data flows is a fancy name for Power Query online. You can transform data, extract, transform loads. You can turn a query from Business Central into a multi-company one. If you want to, you can work with parameters too. You can also make it really interesting, a parameter for the environment, a parameter for the company, and so on. All right. Once we have some data flows, the next logical step is to make use of these data flows. And okay, an interesting candidate is Power BI. So now I'm going to return to Power BI desktop, hit the Get Data button, and then go to Data Flows. I'm not going to use the Business Central connector anymore. I will go here to Data Flows. Voila. First time you do it, you also need to authenticate. And in a few moments, I should get a pop-up asking me which data flow I would like to connect to. Did I click or not? That's the question. Apparently it's working. Right before the webinar, I tested this, but strange. Okay, let me close Power BI desktop and relaunch it. Sometimes that happens. But instead of connecting directly to Business Central, I'm now going to connect to my data flows, which are online, which means Power BI is going to import data from a data flow and not from Business Central. That's the big advantage. So voila, let's do that. All right. Murphy's Law, apparently he has no intent to do this. Okay, trust me, other people have also said this. Normally it works, but click on Get Data Flows. I should be able to go to the data flow. Then don't worry, I have a backup. I have already prepared some reports. With my data sets, I create a finance report, and I prepared an inventory report where I simply said get connect to data flows. Power BI can connect to the data flow. You can see all of the individual queries in each data flow. You can import all of them or some of them. And in Power Query of Power BI, you can still also do some transformations if you would like to. Based on that, I created two Power BI reports, exactly like how I would create them if I would go directly to Business Central. But the big difference is that I'm not going to fetch the data from Business Central. I'm fetching it from the data flows. Well, and the reports are loading, one about inventory, one about finance. And by the way, these ones I created using mostly out-of-the-box APIs. I can see the inventory of all of my items per environment, per company, and the availability. And I defined the difference being, okay, not much in here apparently, but the availability is the inventory plus what is on purchase minus what is on sales, for example. And then I also have a financial report with some chart of accounts grouped by category and subcategory year. I can see the year over year or the general information, and also at the top where I can compare what happened this year with the same period last year. Okay, two Power BI reports. Once ready, you click on Publish. Then the two reports also appear in Power BI online. Now we have them here. Same experience as with any other Power BI reports. Voila. And what you can then also do is go back to the settings, and as usual, look for the data sets of your reports, and there also set a refresh. Now, what is going to happen? Basically, the two reports are based on a data flow. One or multiple data flows. So if you set the refresh on the report, that means how many times per day data will be fetched from the data flow to the Power BI report. It's inside the data flow that you set the refresh schedule to Business Central. So you can refresh for example, the Power BI report 48 times per day, that makes no sense if your data flow only refreshes once per day, because that's when real new data from BC will be coming in. However, data flows can also fetch information from other sources, so that could also be interesting to consider. So the creation of Power BI reports is no more or less difficult once you have the data flow, and you can very easily consume it in Power BI, and like I have demoed. The advantages, I will talk about that a little bit later. Now, what is also interesting is that you can also consume a data flow in Excel, and I see some added value there too, because if you have some experience developing Power BI reports for companies and for users, you surely had the experience that you spent quite some time developing an amazing report to show it to the user or key users. One of the first questions you get is, hey, can we also do this in Excel? Well, with data flows, yes, you can. You can also consume a data flow in Excel, and you don't even have to open Power BI desktop. Basically, if you go into Microsoft Excel, there is a data tab where you can fetch data. There's also a get data button. And if you select the Power Platform, you can go to Dataflows. So let me demo that. I'm going to open Excel. That's one way of doing this. Once Excel is open, a blank workbook, I will go into the Data tab, and then I have my Get Data button, and there I have Power Query. Voila. Or data flows, I should say. Now, you might not see this. If you do not see this, you're probably not logged into with the correct account. So first, you might have to sign out, sign in with the same account that you're using in Power BI or Dataflows. Once you have done that in Excel, then the Get Data button is going to update, and you will see your data flows appearing. Okay, I can click on that. Now, basically, Excel is also going to launch Power Query, first with a pop-up connecting to my data flow, well, different data flow environments, workspaces that I have. And I can see, for example, if I'm going to expand it, I have my transactional data, I have my master data. With Excel, I can connect to each of these tables, but one by one. So I can connect to accounts, import the data, later connect to customers, import the data. So I can do that, and I can click on Transform Data. At that moment, I will also get Power Query, but the Excel version of Power Query, similar to the one in Power BI Desktop. I see my data coming in. I can do some transformations. When ready, and you can do a close and load. And it will load the data in the Excel file as a separate table here. And then you can use this, for example, to create a pivot table or do your thing in Excel. Really nice. But what else can you do? Because we can consume this in Excel, this can also be interesting to work together with a new functionality that we have in Business Central, I think, since the latest release, which is or are the Excel layouts. So if you go, for example, in Business Central to the report layouts page, and you can see all of the reports and their layouts. But I have also created a few custom ones. Okay. Don't want to go into too much detail here, but I will be delivering a session about that in the near future, a live one. But I created a few reports with a data set and some Excel layouts. You can do this as a developer, but you can also do that as a user in Business Central. In this page, you simply look for the reports that you are interested in. You say new layout, you can create a new Excel layout for a report. Now, what is interesting is that in this finance report, if I run it, an Excel file downloads. Now, the Excel file gets a dataset from Business Central as defined by the developer or by the developer in a report object and or a report extension object. And typically that results in a data tab with the fields. and then maybe, okay, let's say a pivot table based on that data type. And the developer can do quite a lot in Excel, actually. Now, imagine that you also would like some other information in this Excel layout, but it's not in the data. So the data set here, for example, doesn't really have some detailed information about the amounts. Was this now sales, purchase, an invoice, what type of invoice, and so on. Well, if you have that information in Dataflow, what you can now do in Excel is in this Excel layout, which was generated by Business Central, you can do data, get data. You can also go to the Power Platform and, well, then fetch all of the other information you might have available there. So let's quickly connect and see what we get. All right, so I'm connecting again to my Dataflow workspace that I created with the master data and the transactions. Well, I have my general ledger Dataflow here or query, and it has my document number, it has document type, it has account number. Okay, interesting columns I might also want to use in this Excel layout. So I can click on Transform Data, which is then going to open the Power Query editor in Excel and load the data from the Dataflow directly, which is interesting because then you can apply some filters and maybe remove the columns you do not really need. Why? Well, the Excel layout I generated from Business Central, but for my Sandbox PBI, and from the Kronos company, not the Kronos 2 company. So, okay, here I can apply some filters. I can also remove the columns I'm not really interested in, and when ready, I can also load this to Excel. Now, what I'm now going to get in Excel is a new table with the data from my Dataflow. So what do I now have in Excel? I have a table from the Dataflow. I have the original data from Business Central. And if I want to, I can use both of these now also in pivot tables or Excel dashboards or whatever I would like to do in Excel. I would not really recommend you to start to use VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP between these two tables. Now, if you want to combine these two tables, that's perfectly possible. You can also both of them load them in Power Query of Excel and there do your a join, for example, between the two tables. But what I think is really interesting is that we have this possibility. So I can talk a lot more about all the nice things we can do here with the Excel report layout. But okay, remember that a Dataflow can also be consumed in Excel. All right, I'm double checking my time. I have about 10, 13 minutes left. That should be fine.
Yeah, great.
So I've shortly explained how we can create a Dataflow. Basically, it's Power Query Online. You've seen how we can consume it in Power BI. You've seen how we can consume it in Excel. That does not mean it's limited to these two. I'm not an expert in, let's say, Power Apps or Power Automate, but I know that when you work in Dataverse, there's also a Dataverse Dataflow version. So maybe I can also access Power BI Dataflows. Could be interesting, maybe also in these scenarios. But remember, Dataflows we have created, I have created, were based on query objects and they are read-only. So in that context, they might also be, and will also be read-only, of course. Now, why Dataflows? Why going through all of this trouble to create Dataflows? Well, one thing is that with the Dataflow, you can source data from different data sources. I've shown how to do it with Business Central. You can use web sources, you can use BC APIs, and so on, standard APIs, custom APIs. But it can also come from other data sources. It could be another Dynamics 365 product. It could be some files you have laying on OneDrive, Power Query or Dataflows has connectors also to import it. It could be on-prem data. You can install the Power BI gateway on a server so that the Power BI service, SaaS, can also access that on-prem data. Could be a possibility. So you're going to build the data model that you would like to consume in different types of reports online. You can source one or multiple data sources. Once you have a data flow, you can also link it to another data flow. So I have, for example, a data flow with master data. I have a data flow with transactional data. I could create a third one that already creates my star data model that does a join between to tables or union or something you would like to do. You can also connect to a data lake directly. You can connect to the Dataverse if you have some data lying there too that you would like to consume. By the way, I haven't really shown that, but if you go online in Power BI and you have your data flows, here at the bottom, there's usually also a link. You can export them in a JSON format. And then you can go to another environment in which you can create new data flow. And there you can click on that import model, in which you then simply import the JSON file. Voila. So that's something that you can do. And this JSON file could, of course, be something you track also in your Visual Studio Code project and put some source control on it. It's kind of general information. The only thing you need to be aware about is that it will store your workspace ID in here somewhere. And that is something you can then also replace on the new environment if you want. All right. So what are the big advantages of these data flows? You can create reusable transformation logic. So that's one advantage. So you have created one Power BI report where you spend a lot of time in Power Query doing transformations and combinations and so on and so on. And then you want to start the next Power BI report and notice, I have to do all of that over again. Well, with the data flow, you don't. You only do it once, you store it in the data flow, and you reuse it in every report where you want it. Besides that, you can share a data flow to be used by other users. That means that the person that needs access to the data flow only needs access to the Power BI workspace. They don't need access to Business Central. So you can have consumers without a Business Central license consuming the data flow data, even when it comes from Business Central. How that goes licensing-wise is something you might have to figure out in the licensing guide, but theoretically, that is, of course, certainly possible. You can create a single source of the truth, which is usually the definition of a data warehouse that you create. The advantage is that people don't need access to Business Central to get their hands on the data flow data. That's an advantage. You can prevent analysts from requiring access to the underlying data source. Of course, you also need to be careful to whom you will be sharing that data flow. Because, okay, a data flow will fetch data from Business Central. What you will have, let me make a small drawing. We will have Business Central. Then you are going to create, let's say, a data flow, which will import the data. And then in the workspace, you can share it with other users, and someone can consume it in Power BI, someone can consume it in Excel. Someone else can also consume it. Users, you will give them access to the data flow. But the data flow in its settings is going to use another user, user X or user Y, to fetch the data from BC. All of the roles and permission sets that you have in Business Central will be applied on user Y. Now, if your user Y is a super user, all data will be imported. But then remember that all of your data flow users will also have access to all of that data, even if they in Business Central might have permission sets that don't allow them to see that data. So be careful with it. So inside data flows, you might also want to set up some kind of security. And if you want to, you can do it because Power BI also supports RLS, row-level security. Don't want to go into detail here, but it might be something to consider or think about. So you can read once from the data source and consume the data in different Power BI reports, Excel reports. You can manage security in the data flow. Data flows, it's Power Query online. You can filter, you can aggregate, you can set up incremental refresh if you have a premium account. It doesn't really work in the Pro account. You need a premium account, which is a little bit more expensive. You can have different refresh schedules. For example, master data needs to be refreshed once per day, but let's say ledger entries multiple times per day. And that might also be a possibility. Well, Just wanted to double check if that was my last slide or not. So, and it was kind of quickly what you can do with Dataflows. We still, of course, have some time left to do some Q&A. But a quick summary, what did I talk about? Or to create custom query APIs, import them in Power BI, import them in Dataflows, consuming a Dataflow in Power BI in Excel, and then some advantages of Dataflows. Might have been a lot of content for about an hour, but the idea was to give you a good introduction to it. So if anyone might have some questions, then feel free to ask.
Great timing, Steven. Let me pick up the last slide. And of course, there is room for questions, and there are a couple of them posted. Let me see. Yeah, my screen should be in view. So the first question was from Arjan. What about maximum number of records that can be retrieved with an API call? Does Power Query implement pagination, or should we use OData max page size header in combination with the next link property and then build a loop? That's the whole question. Does that make sense enough for you?
Yes, it makes sense. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that Power Query is going to do pagination. So, for example, Power Query will receive a batch of records from Business Central. If that is 200 or 2000, I don't know by heart. And then Business Central will send the next batch of records, and Power BI is simply going to import all of that data. And that's why sometimes it can take a long time to refresh. It can take a few seconds per megabyte. It depends on how much data that you are importing. So that's what happens by default. Of course, in Power Query, you can also create a blank query where you can use the M Power Query language, in which you can also write code that imports APIs, which you can also provide headers and all the other things you typically do in Postman. And that might also be an alternative, but it requires, let's say, some more technical knowledge about that. But by default, yes, I think that Power Query will do paging.
Okay. That's one. A second question from Andre Lungo. Can you use a Dataflow for separate projects, different customer data?
Can you use a Dataflow for a separate project? Yes and no. It all depends a little bit where the data comes from. You need to be aware that, for example, the Business Central connector in Power BI or in Dataflow can only fetch information from Business Central environments that are in the same domain. So typically, if it's information from different customers, that will be in different domains. So I don't think that will be possible. So in that case, the answer would be no. If the information is stored somewhere else, then the answer might be yes. And you also need to be careful because, for example, if you're working with a delegated admin as a user in Dataflow or in Power BI, well, the Business Central connector doesn't allow a delegated admin access, even read access to APIs or web services. So that also doesn't work. So basically, you need a user from the user's company's domain to be able to fetch the data, and cross-domain using the Business Central connector is also not possible at this moment.
Okay.
That could be, for example, interesting to fix in, let's say, a real BI scenario where you build your a data warehouse from scratch yourself. But in Dataflows, I don't really see that possible yet. Yeah. Good question, though.
I have an additional question. As you showed in the Excel, or consuming a data flow in an Excel layout that you use for a BC report, how would you deploy the two? I mean, if I would develop in my extension, BC extension, and a report with Excel layout, provided it's going to be deployed, and how am I going to assure that that data flow at the same time, let's say the last version or it's new, is also deployed? Do you have some advice, tips on that?
Yeah, that's indeed a very good question, because everything you develop in Visual Studio Code, your URL files, even your report layouts are deployed when you deploy the extension, but the data flow will not. However, there is a possibility to use PowerShell and to do deployment, for example, of data flows or other Power BI related stuff, and there is a Power BI API that you can access via PowerShell. And like in the Business Central world, we use DevOps or ALGO to automate a lot of these deployments. There's also something similar that we can use in the Power BI world. There's kind of a DevOps there too. So that would be something you could either PowerShell or use the Power BI, let's say, DevOps tools for that. Yeah, but it's something that will not happen out of the box. So you have to build something like that. Correct.
Do you have any experience in that sense that should I then make sure that that Dataflow part is deployed first and then the Excel extension or the extension with the Excel layout, or isn't that just going to be an issue on deployment while deploying, but only on runtime when you're going to really make use of it?
It's going to be a runtime issue. So at the moment that a Power BI report or an Excel layout will be refreshed, it's going to try to access the data flow, and if it then does not exist, there will be an issue. So I think it's best to deploy the data flow first, but the issue will only be when you try to refresh. And that might also be something else I would like to say regarding the refresh of these Excel layouts. So there might also be some kind of, let's say, suboptimal process going on that can be improved by Microsoft. But when you run an Excel layout from Business Central, the data tab is refreshed. But I think by default, the Power Queries are not. So when the Excel file is generated, you might still need to click on that refresh button inside Excel to also fetch the data from the data flow.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that happens out of the box when the Excel file is generated from Business Central, because it generates the Excel file, and then in your ribbon there is that enable script button that you first have to click. Because of that security, the auto refresh doesn't happen. So that might indeed be something to consider too if your Excel layout contains information from a data flow.
Okay, thanks. On the list here are no other questions. So Stephen, wow, a little bit over time, but that's more due to the questions maybe. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to get informed on this side, and I hope the people present also. We're going to close down. Thank you everybody for being here. Have a good remaining part of the day, evening, wherever you are, maybe already the night, and see you after Christmas holidays in January again. For everybody out there, enjoy Christmas time and a good start of the new year. And once again, Steven, thank you very much.
And you too, Luc, and thank you very much for organizing this and letting me be a part of it, and also wish you and everyone else really happy holidays.